Now, you may have just heard an automatic voice saying this meeting is going to be recorded. So please note that we are recording. And so if you have any concerns with that, you can let tech help know, Zero Tech Help. Any additional concerns, you can reach out to Ashley, who's on the other end of that if you're having some tech problems. So we're going to let a few more people join us and then we'll get started. So I have 10:30 on the dot, and we have quite the panelists here today with us. So I want to give them all the time that's allotted to them to share with you today. So really happy to see everybody back here at day 2 of our IDHRC Dawn Hampton conference. I am Sarah Eggert. I'm working for Homeland Security and Emergency Management, and I'll be your room host today. So if you have any concerns or questions, go ahead and reach out to me. But with that said, I wanted to hand it over to Sonia Reyes, the Director of the Office of Latino Affairs of the Iowa Department of Human Rights, to get us started. And thanks again, everyone, for joining us today. Sonia, over to you.
Thank you for the invitation to do this very, very important panel presentation to IDHRC. My name is Sonia Reyes, and I'm with the Office of Latino Affairs. My pronouns are she, her, and ella. And today we're going to be talking about equity in the disaster relief efforts. As you know, as you can see, we have 5 amazing panelists, and I'm going to have them introduce themselves. So I believe our very first one is Courtney. No, it's Emil. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. My name is Emil Bje. I am the VP of Planning and Strategy for Oakridge Neighborhood Services. I am an urban planner by trade and have been working in the affordable housing space for the last 6 years. And my pronouns are she, her, and hers.
Oh, that's me. Good morning. My name is Caleb. I am also a planner by trade and a community activist. Pronouns he, him, his.
Hey y'all, my name is Courtney Reyes. I am the Executive Director of One Iowa and One Iowa Action. My pronouns are she, her, and hers. Glad to be here today.
Hello, everyone. My name is Mira Yusuf, and I'm the Executive Director of Monsoon Asians and Pacific Islanders in Solidarity, and my pronouns are she, her, and hers.
Thank you, panelists, for being willing to give us an hour and a half of your time on this Wednesday morning. So we'll be talking about diversity and inclusion and also equity. So I wanted to first talk about those terms and what they mean, because we hear them a lot of the time without really diving into what they mean. So if you can go to the next slide. So when we talk about diversity, what that means essentially is that you have representation from the different people who live in your state, your city, your community represented at the table. You have their voices there. So what that means is that we make an effort to be able to make sure that they are at the table with the intention of having them speak up and represent the communities that they are part of, or talk on behalf of their own personal or professional background. And that can include race, ethnicity, gender identity, sexual orientation, socioeconomic status, which is one that we tend to forget about a lot. It's important that when we are planning for anything that we have all of these different perspectives. If you can go to the next slide. And I'm not going to ask everyone to raise their hands, but this is kind of how it can feel for people who are from those communities who are underserved or that are not at the table a lot of the time when they get to the table when you invite them. So I thought I would share this picture with you all. Okay, so we can go to the next one. And then when we talk about equity, what that essentially means is that the services and the way that we provide services had to be tailored for the specific individuals or groups that are out there that we have funding for, that we're trying to serve. And we're going to serve in the way that they need to be served, not in one way that will be equal to each other. So we're trying to not have equality, but more of equity to be able to make sure that we serve those individuals or those groups. We can go to the picture. So I don't know if you all can see, but it says, for a fair selection, everybody has to take the same exam. So please climb that 3. And this is what a lot of organizations, a lot of the systems that we're in, we ask of the different groups or individuals. We give one thing for them to do, and everyone has to do it. So that is not equity, because everyone has the same chance, but everyone has different barriers to be able to get things accomplished. The next one. In inclusion, as you can read here, is that once you bring people at the table, once they are there, what are you going to do with them? How are you going to make sure that they feel included? What are you going to make sure that they feel safe and that their voice is being elevated and that they're being listened to, even if it's something that we don't want to hear or that we're not prepared to do something about? It's very important to make sure that once people are at the table, that they feel like they are part of the conversation and the decision making. Next. And so I thought I will share these. We have all the dinosaurs in the classroom, but it is not equitable if not everyone is able to raise their hand as high as everybody else can. Okay, next one. All right, so I had the opportunity to attend a very informative diversity and inclusion training recently that was provided by the sorry, I was muted. So all of this, the following information is from the Center for Disaster and Philanthropy, which is a national organization. They had a training last month or the month before, where they talked specifically about disasters recovery and equity issues around all of the efforts. So one of the things that is very important is that we create a climate where there's going to be inclusivity, because it is not enough to bring people to the table if we're not going to hear what they have to say, or if we're not going to make the changes to the processes that are happening. And it is very, very important that we have the understanding that one size never fits all. And if you've ever ordered anything from like Wish or from overseas, you'll see one size never fits all. All right, next, please. Thank you. So one of the things that we talked a lot about in this specific training that they're bringing information from is that whenever our groups are trying to deal with disaster recovery, our goal is always to bring things back to the way they were. But when we're talking about serving communities that are not being served, or that are being overlooked, or that historically have not been served, the way that things were before was not great to begin with. So that is something that we had to make sure that we keep in mind, that we want to leave things better for them than it was. And so these are some information that I have for you. I'm not going to read it because I know you all can read. Okay, next one. All right. One of the things that we had to make sure that that I always encourage entities is to make sure that they focus on returning communities in supporting communities and connecting them with the resources that are around. A lot of the time, where we go to find out where we should be working or what population we need to put more effort into, we go to data. So we're going to talk about data a little bit, because data is not always reliable. It's not always where you're going to get the information you need for the people who need to be served. There are many groups in our that are not being counted in the U.S. Census, and even in the data here for the state of Iowa. For example, when you go to the U.S. Census, you have to know that you had to pull race and ethnicity to be able to count Latinos. Latinos do not show under race, which is one of the reasons why the Latino community is the largest ethnic group in the country, not just in Iowa, but in the country. But there are not a lot of funds that are available for the Latino community because we don't show in race. And when people are going to go provide funding, they look at race. So we hardly ever get funding for Latino efforts and LGBT efforts, and for people who came to the United States with refugee status. So there's all of these other populations that you are not going to find information on from the U.S. Census or the state data. So it's very important that for us to be conscious about the fact that if you want information about new immigrants, Iowans that came to the state with refugee status, people with disabilities, deaf and hard of hearing, LGBTQIA+, Latinos or Hispanics, you're not going to find that data in the U.S. Census. If you're going to have to, dig deeper and reach out to other resources, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later on. But I always like to talk about this because if we're not conscious about it, we miss all of the groups that are in the state. This is very who's working on disaster relief efforts with some community partners that can help you, provide you some information, can partner with you, or point you in the right direction for other efforts or for other communities. There are many, many communities. We could have a panel of 20, 25 individuals here, but we don't have time. So we picked a few that are a few panelists that represent some of the populations that we have here that are not being served. So that brings us to an amazing panel. We have 4 questions, and I'm going to ask from each panelist, and then you're going to have a chance to answer questions after it. To ask questions after each panelist is done with the first question. After all the panelists are done with the first question. I hope that makes sense. It makes sense in my head. All right, panelists, are we ready? Okay, first question. What are the current barriers that impede underserved Iowans from learning and accessing disaster relief resources in the state of Iowa? And
with regards to how emergency response and recovery resources are managed and delivered in the communities that people live in. A lot of people, I think we need to acknowledge that emergencies and disasters are experiences that are very intersectional, and oftentimes people just don't know what is available from a public perspective, and ensuring that people know what's available in their communities as a public service in disaster situations is a key to overcoming a lot of the barriers associated when communities are experiencing emergencies.
Caleb.
Yeah, so with this one, there's a lot of inequity in the underrepresented communities. And when I think of this question, I think of the Instagram post that went viral at the beginning of the pandemic, where two Latina girls were sitting outside a Taco Bell in the parking lot with their laptops trying to access internet because they didn't have it at home. And so there is a digital divide, and that needs to be addressed, because if people can't get the information on their own, and then you add on top of that a language barrier, they're going to be even farther behind than they already are. And so these systemic problems are just going to pile upon these underrepresented communities, these vulnerable communities, when you get the pandemic and you pile on top of their HO. And so I think in 2020, the general population saw how hard it is for these communities to be on the same level of the other ones. And two, you know, with the lack of language access, you know, making sure that residents, community members could get the help. You know, in Iowa, we didn't have language access during the pandemic for Spanish speakers. And so an amazing group of Latinos got together to do the Spanish helpline, all volunteers. And, you know, that's so important that we didn't have the financial capital to do things, but we had the social capital to come together and work together to provide for our community. And, you know, communities need both the financial and social capital.
Thank you, Caleb. Courtney.
So I serve the LGBTQ community and advocate for the LGBTQ community. And it was really highlighted for our community when we looked at a disaster like the pandemic or derecho, that life needs to continue on some levels. And so many LGBTQ folks are in those low-paying jobs due to workplace discrimination. And so while we don't have good access to healthcare, and we don't have those resources at our fingertips, we're still being asked to do this work that's essential, but like the rest of the country gets to stay at home and work from home. And we know that there's a great privilege in that, right? And that some folks have to keep working so our society keeps going, but we don't also value those folks to have access to that quality healthcare and the protection that they needed. So we really saw folks be impacted that way. Also, to be able to get disaster relief, you have to feel like you can show up as your true self to get that information. And I really think of folks with legal names and correct names. So maybe that paperwork isn't going to line up, and how is that going to be received when I'm trying to navigate these systems that aren't always so clear. And that can be really difficult, and just folks maybe can't take on that burden of being misgendered and dead named. And, you know, there's a lot of barriers there. So I think that some folks just go without instead of causing harm to themselves of trying to jump through the hoops.
Courtney, could you give us a little bit more information about what you mean when you say misgendered or a dead name?
Absolutely. So I'm talking a lot about our trans and non-binary community members, but anyone in the LGBTQ community, we all have pronouns and we all have names. So my pronouns are she, her, and hers, but maybe somebody doesn't use the pronouns that the rest of society believes that match up with them. And so they can be misgendered And so if I were talking about Sonia and I said, well, he is going to do this, that would be me misgendering Sonia because Sonia uses she, her pronouns. And so that can be really hard on the mental health and mental well-being of trans and non-binary individuals, because if you're constantly not affirmed as who you are, that's a really big struggle. And then dead name is when someone chooses a new name for themselves. So I was assigned Courtney at birth, and that name fits for me, that name works for me. And there are some folks in the LGBTQ community where that name doesn't serve them anymore. And so that would be their dead name, and they pick a new name for themselves. But maybe they haven't legally been able to change their name because there's a lot of barriers, financial, paperwork, etc., to get your name changed, that you have to fill out your paperwork so it says Courtney, but you really want to be called Jack. And that's your real name, and that's what fits with your body. And then so the whole time you're going through this process, you're being called the wrong name. And then you have to choose, do I emotional labor want to tell you to please call me this name, or do I just go with it and that harm is caused to me? Because a lot of forms and paperwork are not set up to have your legal name and the name you want to be called. And this impacts the trans and non-binary community in a great way. But if we find a cisgender man whose name is Robert and he goes by Bob, everybody is okay with that because that seems easier to digest. But so people do that all the time, but we have to be able to create space for that. Does that answer your question, Sonia?
Yes, thank you. All right, Mira.
So just quick information about Monsoon. So we are an organization that provides services to survivors and victims of domestic violence, sexual assault, sex trafficking, dating violence, and other forms of gender-based violence in Iowa. And we also have a national project that that provides training and technical assistance nationally for API-led organizations that are trying to improve their sexual assault services in the Asian and Pacific Islander community. So we provide those training and technical assistance in the US, continental US, and also in the US territories in the Pacific, and then also an international project. So this question really kind of like, my question is like the fact that I just want to highlight that whenever there's a disaster, it really exposes and magnify existing social, political, and economic injustices and inequities, right? So I just want to kind of like highlight that, because when we think about underserved Iowans, they are already underserved. So therefore, they already do not have access to certain resources. So when there is a disaster or a pandemic, that highlights, that magnifies. So I think it is also important that we kind of like state that in the US itself, when we think about contemporary disasters, that it occur in the context of historical and enduring colonialism, institutionalized racism, heteropatriarchy, and also systemic oppression. So I think it is important that we name that in order for us to really think about those barriers when we are working with underserved Iowans, underserved communities specifically. So just like Caleb had stated, the importance of language, the importance of having language access for certain communities, especially for newly arrived immigrants, newly arrived refugees, and then the fact about the digital divide, seeing that photo, like if they already do not have the access to internet and the web, therefore that's already an issue. So I think there are so many different barriers that's already in existence, and then it just highlighted by that disaster. So I just kind of want to state that in itself, they're already underserved, and then it just magnified. And then it is also important to kind of like highlight that while the effects of disaster are widespread, we have to, like, for example, derecho, it's widespread in Cedar Rapids, right? White folks like got are basically affected by the disaster, but hardship is not distributed equally. So I think we just have to kind of like highlight that and pinpoint that. So I'll stop there. Then we can discuss more.
Thank you, Mira. Yes, it is very important for us to remember that the way that the policies we have in place, that the way that everything is done, it is not with the goal of serving the communities that have been minoritized in the state and in the country. So with that in mind, whenever we're going to try to serve Iowans, like to answer Janet's question in the chat, one of the recommendations is to always look to serve the minoritized communities. And then when you target the minoritized communities, you will serve all. But we will get more into that in the following question. That's a great question. And Janet, and if it's not answered by the end of our panel, please let us know, because we have some other questions that I think might answer your question. Okay, question number 2. How can volunteer groups and agencies reach underserved Iowans? And just to give you panelists some information, a lot of the disaster relief efforts are led by volunteer groups in the different cities and counties. And we'll go ahead and get started. We'll go backwards now. We'll start with Mira.
I think, Sonia, earlier you mentioned about connecting with the community prior to the disaster, right? I think that is crucial, that we build with each other in order for us to, when we think about, for me, when I think about disaster or just prevention in itself, you do things prior to what will happen because you want to prevent those, right? So I think it is important that we build those community resources, reach out to like communities that might not be in the census. So sometimes, just like you said, Sonia, earlier about census, that census doesn't really reflect the true, like what's on the ground, right? So if you look at like Pacific Islanders, do folks know where the Pacific Islanders are, right? Where are they? But they are in Iowa. So I think it is important that if you are working for an organization or a government agency, that you get to know the community that you are serving, that you don't just look at the census, but build upon your knowledge of who's there. What are the languages? Who are the immigrants and refugee communities that are incoming, right? So therefore, it is important that we don't get lazy in like building our knowledge about the communities that we are serving. Also, it is important that when we think about solution to this, when you are volunteering, it is also important to know that certain communities have been in a lot of disasters, right? Some of them had been here because of the fact that there is conflict, there are maybe climate changes. There are just certain things from our home countries that had happened. That's why we are in this country. So it is also important not just to look at the communities of who is there, but also the solutions that might be community-based, right? So collective mutual aid, like collective actions. What are those? Because our community, immigrant and refugee communities, have already those existing mutual aid, collective action strategies to help each other. So also getting to know those strategies that are also community-based in order to broaden these solutions. So it shouldn't just be a solution from the top, but it's also be a solution that should be coming from the ground in the communities that you are assisting. That's a lot, but yeah.
Amazing information. Thank you, Mira. We'll go to Courtney.
Yes. So something that comes to mind when I think about this is, and maybe it's already been hit on, is that we need to see ourselves in the volunteer group. So it's not this kind of savior mentality, like we'll come in and fix it. Is really having good representation in your volunteer groups. and being sure to ask what folks need before just saying like, oh, I bet they need this. Like example from derecho comes to mind when a friend of mine was organizing, and she was doing this all of this incredible work, and my wife and I are like, okay, let's raise some money and then we'll go buy all these supplies and we'll drive. And then it was like, oh wait, let's ask her, what does she actually need on the ground? And is it better just to send the cash? Do you need the money, or do you need us to actually go and pick it up and deliver? Like, how does that help? Because if you look, there are people community organizing already. That happens immediately. People are doing that. How do you help support them and not take over their efforts, but to really amplify them in not make it, I love this, somebody says volunteer with, not for. I love that. That how do you be an assistant rather than taking over? Because listen to the people of that community. And then another thing that comes to mind specifically for the LGBTQ community of this is just to like make your group welcoming and affirming, so that the LGBTQ community knows, or a refugee community knows, insert whatever group you're trying to help, that they know that you see them as human beings and this isn't charity. Nobody wants charity. We want liberation. We want to be able to help ourselves. And we all know we need help from other people, but how do we not feel bad about it, not draped in shame, not, I can't think of what the word, like poverty porn. Like it's not like exploiting people, but it's helping people and meeting them where they're at and saying like patting yourself on the back, but how do you really reach out and help someone and help them do the work that they've probably already been organizing for on the ground?
Thank you, Courtney. And if I can just piggyback on what Courtney said regarding making your space inclusive. As a queer person myself, whenever I'm interacting with somebody and that person introduces themselves and tell me their pronouns, I automatically know that they have some type of understanding and training, and that they feel safe automatically. And because that's not always the case when you're interacting with people, especially when there's a power difference when you go and ask for services or when you need something for those individuals. So that is a very easy way to start to make your group inclusive, by just adding pronouns, by adding, oh yeah, these services are here for people who are documented or undocumented, for people who have a social security number, and for those who don't. That way you're not really, say, calling people out, you're just making blank, not blank statements, but overall statements that will make people feel included and that that place will serve them. All right, next, Caleb.
Yeah, I'm just going to echo what Courtney said is, the poverty porn. You hear the phrase, let them pull themselves up by their bootstraps, but what if they don't have boots? And the savior mentality, leave your phones at home. Like, this isn't about your likes, your pictures. These are people's lives. These are people's well-being. And so don't go into the community thinking you know it all or you know what they need to do to fix their lives. That's irrelevant. If you've got that mentality, just leave, to be quite honest. And, like other people have said, find people in the community who are already doing this work and support. You're not there to lead, you're there to support. And if you really want to help underrepresented groups, you ask how you can help. You don't put the focus on you or your organization or making sure that you can do it. You're not there to proselytize. You're not there to be their savior. You're there to ensure that they have the rights and the access that everyone else should have.
Thank you, Caleb. Amal.
I think we need to transform the way that we approach service delivery and relationship building with underserved Iowans. Oftentimes, one of the statements that is, echoed again and again, it's, these communities are so difficult to reach. But rarely do you hear organizations that are coordinating services ask themselves, how are we inaccessible? So fundamentally, I think we need to transform the way that we approach relationship building and service delivery with underserved communities. And we also need to make sure that the way that we connect with them is grounded in strength-based relationship building. As Courtney said earlier, communities are already they're already managing, and they're already recovering from emergencies and disasters on their own. So with or without institutional or public support. So what we need to be thinking about and doing more of is being proactive about how can we build on the incredible mobilizing capability that these communities already have, and how can we support them and make sure that we are focused on asking the question of how can we be more accessible to them rather than making the statements about how they're so difficult to reach.
Thank you. And there's question in the chat, or it says, sometimes it is difficult for folks from the dominant population to find underserved communities, particularly the leaders of organizations, to do appropriate bridge building. How do we reach them to be inclusive, to involve them in planning and support? And anyone can answer.
We're all being
Go
kind
ahead,
of
Courtney.
shy here, which from what I've gathered, maybe we're probably not shy humans. I think that's something to keep in mind as you reach out to people is paying them for their time. We're often asked to give labor for free, and that just feels more like an exploitation of us rather than valuing us as human beings. We always say, like, you wouldn't ask an accountant to come in and give you a presentation or educate you and not pay them for their time. So why are we not paying people of color to educate us and inform us, even if they don't have like an official training title, because that's rooted in white supremacy. So how do we help break those things down? And then when they get there, I know one of the most frustrating parts of my job is I get invited to a lot of places to be an LGBTQ person, and then I'm the only one, and I'm expected to speak for the queer community. And they're like, oh, but you're also Latinx, right? Like, so can you speak on that? Like, absolutely not. I don't speak for an entirety of a community. I'm just one person that has multiple identities. So really, getting more people than just one voice in the room from a group of individuals, because all of us have, we're very passionate, but I'm guessing we're all answering questions differently, right? So like everybody brings something different to keep challenging ideas, pay people, listen to them. And then when you listen to them, take their action, take their suggestions and put them to work. Otherwise, you're just inviting us into the room, but not actually doing anything with that labor.
Once again, I'm just going to echo everything Courtney said. I feel like from here on out, I'm just going to be Courtney's hype man.
I love it. You should go first next time and I'll do it for you.
No. But yeah, there's a lot of times I've experienced where I am the token in the room. I was like, oh, you do planning, you're Latino. Like, hey, let's have you in the room. And then once you get to that room, that's what matters to me. Like, yeah, that's cool for inviting me, but the room's got to be welcoming. I'm going to quote Jim Thompson from IDEA. And, he said this in one of my first meetings is, you got to look down under the table at the shoes. You want people with different shoes. That means they're coming from different places and different walks of life. And that has stuck with me for 3 years, whatever. It's stuck with me for a while. And, when you go to these communities, whether it be Marshalltown, Storm Lake, Perry, there's going to be a community center, and it might not be your traditional community center. It might be a grocery store. It might be a bodega. It might be a restaurant. But there's people who work there who own those shops, who know everything going on in the community. They know all the chisme. They know everything going on. And those are the people you want to connect with. Those are the people you want to invite. Because if someone asks me to volunteer for something, I'll say no, but I'll always recommend someone else from the community. Like, oh, have you reached out to this person? And so if you get that no, don't just give up. Don't be lazy, because this is going to take work. This is going to take effort. You need to reach out, because one no that's fine, but you need to find people in these communities, and it's not doing it in the normal way. It's not doing it in the cliched way. It's going to take a lot of effort.
And to add to that, I think one of the entities that are overlooked in terms of disaster planning, support delivery and recovery, there, as someone coming from the housing space, there are housing providers and landlords across our communities working with them to reach these underserved Iowans. I think they can serve as critical connectors.
Thank you. We'll go on to the next question. I think that we have answered some of those. All right. What can decision makers do to ensure that there's representation from your communities where decisions are being made? Do you have anything else to add? I feel like we kind of touched on this one already, but anything else to add?
Just kind of echoing Caleb and Courtney, how important it is to invite sometimes non-traditional leaders that might not be in the Western perspective of what is a leader is. So I think those are crucial. And then when you invite them, don't just make them as advisory, because for me, advisory has this thing where you will listen but not really follow. So make them like this authentic decision makers. And then including not just male, right? Inclusion of different genders, that is crucial when you're thinking about inviting so-called quote unquote leaders, and especially young people. I think sometimes what's missing in this piece as well is like how then we could also include youth voices when we are thinking about decision makers. So those are the things that I just kind of want to add to that point.
I love that so much. The youth has so many great ideas and they're often dismissed. If we could just listen to them a little more and help put them into action, that would be incredible. Thanks for bringing that up. One of the things I thought of just additionally, and Sonia and I have shared this experience many, many times, is when you have folks in the room and a person with a marginalized identity has the courage to speak up and do the emotional labor and say something that maybe the whole room doesn't want to hear, and then 10 people text us or direct message us personally and say, oh my gosh, thank you so much for saying that. That was so important. I need you in that room to say that out loud, because if it's just my voice speaking up and saying something, it's me just waving my pride flag. But if I say something and 10 other people in the room are like, that's so important, that has a huge impact. It happens all the time. I'm guessing I'm not the only person on this panel that that's happened to. But stand up and support those folks when they say something that maybe is a little uncomfortable.
Yes, it's so important. We hear this term ally, and it is so important as allies. I am an ally to many other underserved and minoritized populations. And I've done my research on how I can support when people are speaking, or when people are brave enough to bring up those uncomfortable conversations or topics. And it is so important to empower them and thank them and ask more questions and clarification from them when they're speaking, because believe me, it took a lot for them to speak up. And if they are not heard, or if they don't feel validated, they're not going to come back to your meeting. Or if they come back, they will be quiet. And that is not what we're trying to do. So that particular population might not get served. And So that's one of the things that I wanted to piggyback on what Courtney said. Yes, being an ally is also important. Back people up when they're speaking, when they're saying something that even if it feels uncomfortable, thank them for being brave and sharing what they're sharing, because it is really hard, especially when they're the only person of color, the only queer person, the only person with disabilities, etc. So that's very, very important. Something else that I just would like to add is create your list of the different underserved populations, and from there target your efforts to those who are being marginalized. And I know I said this earlier, but that is also important. And target your efforts for them to be served. And then when you do that, everyone else will be served. And that is also important. And we'll go to the next question. Oh, let me see. Is there a question in the chat? Okay. Okay, so the last question that we have is, what should diversity, equity, and inclusion look like in organizations that have resources to assist all Iowans in the disaster relief efforts? And we will start with Caleb.
Thank you. You know, I think number 4 goes back to number 3, and all these questions are built upon each other. You know, now that you've got a group, a leadership team, whatever you want to call it, that is not just narrowly focused, that they don't just have their blinders on. You know, you want representation from a community, because if you're in community X in Iowa, your population is going to be different than if you're in community B. And if you're in community B, you need to serve your population there. So, you know, my concern is always, you know, when you're looking around and you're making decisions in your room, is it representative of the people who are at the grocery store that day? Is it representative of the people at the grocery store the day before? And that's what's important, because if those voices aren't at the table, things are going to be left out. And it can't always be someone like me. You know, I have a lot of privilege. You know, it's got to be people who don't always have the privilege that I have. You know, there are many, many, many great leaders out there, and you know, I like to call them the hidden leaders. You know, you find those hidden leaders in the community that can help you lead, that can bring you along. Because if we don't bring everyone up and get the equity for all residents, and I say residents because I mean everyone living in the state, regardless of status, because that's what is important. Because if everyone is successful, that makes everyone's lives in the state better. And, you know, you can read study after study that, you know, diverse boards make a business more money, diverse boards make an organization more robust. But until you take that to heart, it's really irrelevant. And so, you know, I'm always gonna go at, make sure that you are inclusive. Don't just invite these people to the table. Don't just invite me to the table, because I know when I'm a token. I know when you're just asking me there to bring some color to your picture for your Facebook post. Make sure you're empowering the people that you're asking. Because if I'm not empowered, I'm not coming back. And I can guarantee I'm gonna tell everyone else with me.
Amal?
I would go back to what I said earlier. I think really being intentional about the ways that we build relationships and the ways that we connect with communities, making sure that we are not approaching these connections from a savior perspective, from a, you know, a helper perspective. Because when you do that, it takes away from the agency that people have, and you unconsciously end up dismissing the community's ability to do for themselves. So holding ourselves to be more diverse and equitable and inclusive within our organizations and in our communities means recognizing and celebrating people's agency, and also understanding that when an individual in our community does well, we all do well. And by supporting a community that's underserved in our community, we are strengthening our community at large. So really being very intentional about the ways that we connect with people and the language that we use and the sharing that we do. We need to know that this is a collective effort, that it's not one person doing for the other, or vice versa. It takes truly a collective effort and moving forward with a collective mindset for us to do better now and in the long term.
Mira?
I think for me, it's about the sharing of resources, especially like if you have ethnic-based, community-based organization that might be already in existence in that community. So when a mainstream organization is maybe applied for a funding, right? So making sure that partnering and allocating funds that's specifically for that organization in order for them to provide those resources and services in case that there is a disaster, right? So preparing also those resources. And for me, it's not just like inviting individuals within the organization, but it's also sharing those funds. Because usually when we look at who gets funded, are not like ethnic-based organizations, are those organizations that know how to write, know how to basically write those grants and already have connections with those agencies, right? So it is important that those organizations that have that kind of privilege, that they share, they allocate their funding and really allocate funding. Not just like if you're asking for $1 million and then give, for example, give Embark just 1,000 or 10,000, that is not right. It needs to be totally in equity. So if we're thinking about organization, that also should be part of it. Like how then do we also share those funding? And then one thing as well is like, since my work is on gender-based violence, it is also important then that we also have to look at of like how domestic violence or even sexual assault can increase when there is a disaster, right? So maybe then even connecting and maybe getting the training already from different rape crisis centers or DV organizations in order to be prepared in really providing those like just resources and services just in case. So it is important for me, those costs out, those funding, and then making sure that gender-based violence is also not forgotten when we think about disasters.
Thank you, Mira. Courtney?
I love that, Mira. To not make us have to jump through so many hoops to get to the money, because I know for a small organization like ours, it's a pro and con. Do we have enough staff time to like put together a good application? And then is that payoff enough to make it happen? Because we are all trying to do so many things and serve the community in such a way. And then when you add all kinds of different barriers to that, those applications can be really daunting, and folks don't even apply. So they don't even have the chance to get those dollars. And then the thing that comes to mind for me with this is that scarcity mindset that is, we only have this certain amount of money, and how do we make the most impact? And that most impact is coming from one viewpoint, and how do we challenge that to like, where does our community really need this money? And so just really looking at the process from front to back of how we get money in the hands of the people that are doing the work. And then that goes to the follow-up, like what kind of reporting is involved, and can this be used for staffing, where sometimes that's like we have to pay people. I know our org is very people, that's my biggest expense. And then there's huge grants to help us. It's like, oh, well, it can't be for staffing. I'm like, that's what makes my organization go. So when you put all those exclusions on things, it makes it really difficult for people to apply and then utilize those dollars. And just to remember that we're intersectional, like when we're looking at we're not just an LGBTQ org. We're impacting so many different lives, just like the folks on this call. Our work, we're not one-dimensional. We have a lot of things that make us up.
Thank you. And I just have a few things that I just wanted to mention to answer this question. One of them is make sure that you provide training for your group or your organization on how to, one, be a good ally, but also on how to work with the different populations. On cultural awareness is so important. So people, when they come to the table, they feel welcomed. And never be afraid to say, hey, I apologize, I called you the wrong pronoun, or I called you the wrong name. It's okay, that goes a long way. Or a lot of the time people assume that I'm from Mexico, I'm from El Salvador. And the people get very flustered, and then it's okay. You just say, oh, I don't know it all either. I'm very ignorant about other continents and things like that. So it's okay to not know. Just apologize and don't make a big deal out of it. Just move on. An apology can go a long way. And one of the other things is the budget. When you're putting together your budget, make sure that you allocate funds to pay interpreters, not just language interpreters, but sign language interpreters, because we often forget about the deaf and hard of hearing communities. And that's another group, just like the LGBTQ community and the people with disabilities communities, that there's so many intersectionalities just within those. So it's also important that if this is something that your group wants to do to be able to serve everybody, it has to show on your budget line that you allocated specific funds for this. Also, with a lot of our communities, our community leaders are people who have jobs that are outside of human services and social and racial justice. A lot of the community leaders in the different communities are people who have full-time jobs, 2, 3 jobs sometimes, but they are trusted members of the community who people go to always. We have one on the line in this webinar. Her name is Emilia Marroquin from Storm Lake. I went to Storm Lake and Emilia and a group of other people went to lunch, everyone knew Emilia. And just because she works in the community and she's been volunteering for a long time. And so it's not always the people who hold jobs or have titles like all of us on this panel, but we can help you get connected with those individuals that we know, and they can help get you connected with others. And if you are from a population that it's the dominant population, make sure that your people from your group are the minority at the table. It has to be the other groups that are underserved and minoritized who are the majority at the table making decisions and giving input. And like Mira said, when you have a board or you have a council, and then you're like, oh, let's create a diversity group, and this person, that's where all these brown people or queer people are gonna go, it doesn't feel like a legitimate effort. So make sure that they are at the table where decisions are being made, because that's where change happens. And the other thing, create relationships first with the community, with your neighbors, and get to know them. That way you will create that trust within them, because you have to earn their trust first so they can let you in within their community. Then with the funding, something that I wanted to make sure that I mentioned is, we have a lot of organizations in the state that are doing amazing work, but they are white-led, and they might have a few people sprinkled here and there on their board who are from underserved populations, but it is all white-led. And so a lot of funders and a lot of other entities go to those organizations because it's a lot easier to talk with someone who doesn't have an accent, who understands the system here, who has the expertise and the professional education to write grants, but they are not the ones really serving the community. So it is also important to go to those grassroots organizations, those who look like their community that they're trying to serve. And the other thing is, again, Mira mentioned it, data collection. Some of our community members refuse to give out their data because they don't trust government, even if it's a nonprofit. So it is very important to edit what it is that you're asking from, and why do you really need all that data? You know, where is it gonna go? So do you really need their full names, their social security numbers, their address, and all of that? And if you don't, then I would say don't ask for it. But those are just some of the other things that I wanted to mention. And now we can go on to the next slide. All right, any questions from the audience? I'm okay with awkward silence, by the way, so we can. All right, we can move on to the next slide. I have some resources listed on there. So at the Iowa Department of Human Rights, we have 7 offices that work with all of these. We have these 7 offices that you can see that are statewide. And one of the main things that we do is create relationships with local organizations that are working with the community because we don't provide direct services. So we work and support all those organizations. So we are here as a resource for all of you. My counterparts for the other offices are amazing, and this is what we do. We create relationships. So if there's a specific population that you're trying to reach, feel free to email me, and I can put you in contact with the right person at the right office if I don't know someone from that population. Next slide. For the Latino community, like Caleb mentioned, a group of community volunteers started the Iowa Spanish Helpline. Now it's under the Office of Latino Affairs, and we created this in partnership with Embark because when COVID started, there was no language access for Spanish speakers in the state. And we make up almost 7% of the population in the state. So that was very, very concerning. So a group of community volunteers started volunteering their time to answer phone calls. And so this is a great resource. Anyone who's Spanish or English speaker too can call and get assistance with filling out forms, resources and referrals, case management, advocacy, anything that the person needs. Okay, next slide. And these are some tools that I apologize that you can barely see the lettering, but you will have, yes, and you will have these slides. So you can click on these different links. One of the first one is Equity, Diversity and Inclusion Action Toolkit for organizations. So this is a tool that you can use to create your own plan. And so are the other ones. The last one is from the Center for Disaster Philanthropy, and it talks a lot about funding and how to make sure that the funding streams are equitable as well when it comes to disaster relief. Next slide. Okay, and that is it. This is our contact information. Does anyone have any questions, comments? This is we have until I think about 25 more minutes if you have any more questions or any other comments from the panel. Oh, there's a question in the chat. It says, what is the best way for me to get to know the communities that exist within my local area?
I'm going to follow Caleb. Caleb stated earlier about those stores, those beauty salons, those nail salons, those that maybe are owned by a non-mainstream population. So therefore, like just going there and then getting to know folks. And then from there, you will learn about the community and also just having conversation and being curious of asking, what is their story? You know, like I think folks always want to know, like always want to share like their story. So therefore, I think it is important that we become curious about each other. So I think that's just one of them. And going to parties that is hosted by, by Asian population, Latinos, Latinx, African community, LGBT community, just go to those parties and really get to know them. Because when you go to those parties, then if you're invited to those parties, that means that they see you as a family. So yes, saying yes and going to those parties.
And I would add, I'm not very familiar with Davenport, Glenn, but I do see that you're associated with a faith-based organization. I would say if you have the capacity to host community events, and meet your neighbor, get to know your community type of an event where there's food involved and it's outside, considering that we're still in the midst of COVID, but I think it's safe to host small gatherings outside based on the level of comfort that people have. I would say if you're able to facilitate those types of gatherings, if you're able to connect with other faith-based organizations in your community and find and have conversations about ways that you can be more inclusive and more welcoming of the underserved and underrepresented citizens in your community, I think it's a great start.
I think a good way to get involved is to build your confidence. I know that I'm always a little nervous when I'm reaching out to a new community if I don't know a lot about them. And so educating yourself, shameless plug always for One Iowa. This is what we do every single day is we train organizations big and small of how to get some really foundational knowledge of the LGBTQ community, how to be welcoming and affirming to us, because LGBTQ folks, we just don't live, in the capital city. We live all over the state in rural areas. And so education is such a key part of that. And I know that the folks on this panel can point you to or will educate you as well. And so that I think is a great way to get folks involved, and we're happy to help in any way. I think someone dropped our inclusivity trainings in the chat, and happy to do that again, but we're always here as a resource, so reach out to us.
I'm gonna echo them all. I feel like I've been echoing all the other panels because they're so amazing. But food. I try to have one meeting a week with outside of people from work at one of the grocery stores here in town, just to connect with people, just so people see me around. Invite people to go get a burrito, invite people to go, and that's how you get to know someone. That's how you get to know me. If you invite me to go get some burritos, like I will tell you whatever you want to hear. And so just, it's kind of like dating. You've got to really just put yourself out there. You got to be open and honest, and you're going to make mistakes. I make mistakes, but I still want to be an ally. And, if I make a mistake, I know Sonia's going to call me out. And, you know, she's not doing it because she hates me. She's doing it because she loves me, and she's an amazing mentor and wants to see me do better. And I think we can all do that for each other. So Glenn, it is scary. It is scary to go out in communities that you're not from, that you didn't grow up with, but we're all in the same boat. I mean, there's communities that I have no experience in. There's communities that, you know, don't know me and that I don't know them, but, you know, I still need to reach out to them, you know, not just as a community advocate, but also as a planner. And that's something that, you know, we all have these fancy job titles, but there are people in all these communities who are doing such great work that need to be lifted up and cherished and acknowledged.
And just to add to that, right now it's Pride Month. So there's going to be a lot of festivals and just gatherings and things online and off and in person. So look that up. Look in your area what is happening for Pride Month, and go to those festivals. Get to know people. Get to know organizations, and that's how you're going to start creating those relationships. Invite them to come and you know, to your meetings and tell them where you're from. And I would say start building those relationships first before you ask them to serve, because not everyone is able to. And you know, if you're going to invite them, be prepared that some people, because they are, some of them are low income, they work multiple jobs, they have children, or they are here without any family support because they either came here as with refugee status or as new immigrants. They might not have family members. So be ready. If you invite them to your meeting, it might be the whole family that comes with children. So make sure that childcare is available. Make sure that you're going, if you don't tell them that you're going to feed them and their children, they're not going to go. And those are the voices you want, because those are the voices that are trusted in the community. And they are the ones who will tell you, okay, this works for our community here. Because what works here in Des Moines might not work in Storm Lake or Denison or Davenport. So you want to create those relationships. Then yeah, look, you know, during Latino Heritage Month for, you know, go to the Latino festivals, you know, for API month to go to the API event. And that's how you're going to start creating those relationships and being intentional. You can, what I always tell organizations is maybe have at least one person, at least one, in your group or organization that will be doing this, that their job is, or a big part of their job is community relations, building that trust with the community. It has to be a paid position or an intentional position if your group is a volunteer group, for them to be able to do that. Because it's all about being intentional and being able to do it ahead of time.
I want to say a couple more things. And, you know, many communities where there's meat packing plants, there's multiple shifts. And so understanding that if they're on a second or third shift, your schedule doesn't work for their schedule. And just because you're a 9 to 5 and they're not, doesn't mean they're irrelevant. We need to get input from everyone regardless. And, you know, I'm going to say the same. You know, I'm not in the metro. So, you know, for the statewide organizations, look outside the metro. You know, there are people in rural Iowa, there are people in micropolitans, there are people in small towns. You know, they all deserve to have their voice heard. And I know sometimes as a Latino that lives in rural Hardin County, a lot of times I'm like, where do I fit in? You know, I'm not in the metro. You know, I'm not in one of these other small communities. I'm in the middle of nowhere. Really, I am. So how do you get those people to fit in? How do you get those people to the table? And those are huge questions that we don't have the answer for.
And yes, Glenn, the Mercado on Fifth in the Quad Cities is amazing. Right, any other questions or comments from the audience?
Yeah, I have a question, Sonia. This is Michael Rojas with Volunteer Iowa. I wanted to touch on something that Courtney and Caleb talked about earlier. Courtney, you had talked about just asking those hard questions and being the person to speak up within those communities. And Caleb, you talked a little bit about like kind of tokenism. I was wondering if you guys could speak to maybe some self-care tactics and how you guys deal with that emotional weight that we could potentially take to some of our peers that may be in similar situations. I know that that's a somewhat of a large reaching question and we all have our self-care tactics, but if you guys could potentially speak about that, I think that would be good.
Thank you, Courtney. Yeah, it is mentally exhausting to be the token in a room and know it. And it took me a long time to get to where after I leave a meeting to decompress. And what works for me is meditating. It sounds super cheesy. I started doing it in my early 30s. And being able to talk to people about it, being able to find a safe space, and whether it just be like me getting out my emotions and getting out the frustration. So for me, it's a process. It's the breathing exercises, it's the journaling about it, and it's talking to my spouse about it. And also too, something I try and do is talk to my kids about it. Like, hey, this happened at this meeting, and it sucks. It's not fun. But just being open and honest about the things that I experience, because they're brown too. They're going to have similar experiences. I hope they don't, but I would be naive in thinking that they will not. And so, yeah, and there are times where I have accepted the token role, and it's like, all right, maybe if I keep going, it will change. And there have been times like, nah, peace out. I'm not going back. I'm not interested. And for me, it's case by case. And, sometimes I fail and sometimes I succeed, but, I always try and look at the big picture. What is the big picture for the community? Is this too much weight for me? And if it is, I can step back. There are plenty of people out there who do great work. And, if I am the token, what is it achieving? And I guess at the end of the day, that's what I ask myself for anything, whether I'm the token or not. If I'm a volunteer in an organization or, doing something, what is it achieving at the end of the day?
I love that so much. Caleb, I love how you talk to your children about it. We try to be really open in our house too, of like, this really hard thing is happening. Like the Iowa legislature, we had 15 anti-LGBTQ bills introduced. And that's a huge part of my job. And I could either like not tell them that this is going on, or they could know why their mom is so stressed and like what's happening and why we have to keep fighting. And because they have to keep learning too. We can put them in a bubble, but it's going to burst at some point. Some things that I try to do to help take care of myself is ask myself if I want to be seen or do I need to be heard? And sometimes I really need to be seen. Like I need my queer, Latinx identity, woman, mom, all of those things. I need to be seen and affirmed. And there's sometimes where I just really need to be heard. So I leave all those things behind and I just keep pushing forward. So you hear the point I'm trying to make or hear this thing I'm trying to teach you. And that's really hard because it's almost like I have to have a separate person that shows up to meetings and this person is protected and this is my job. And I show up and I know it could be really terrible. But with the follow-up to that is that I go to therapy. 10 out of 10 recommend therapy. I know that's not accessible to everyone though. So that's something that I have a privilege of doing. But then giving myself time to process it as a human being is really important to me, whether that's through movement with yoga and breath work or walking with my family and doing some of those like classic self-care things. But I get to experience that, yes, I did just spend the last 4 months of my life fighting anti-LGBTQ legislation. But at the end of the day, those laws that were trying to be introduced were an attack on my family. And that's a lot to carry. And so how do you get to feel that too, but knowing that I'm not personally responsible for saving everyone. That is always a key. Like we're just one of all of this incredible group of people fighting for what we're fighting for. But checking in on your folks, check in on people who you know that their lives are being impacted by the things around them and let them know that you support them is a huge, huge support for folks like me.
That is a great question. And I think that it's so important for all of us to recognize that if you are bringing people to the table that don't have the privilege that we all have here to work in organizations where we have healthcare and we have access to support in mental health, that some of the community members that you might bring in might not have that. So it is even more important to be able to support them once they're at the table, to check in with them afterwards to see how they felt, implement surveys that are not all just written, but just have the chair or the vice chair or someone assigned to, create that contact with the person, because it can be very triggering. We've had a new immigrants here in the United States who have gone through a lot of barriers, war, extreme poverty, abuse, and which is why they're here, right? No one wants to leave their homes just because. If they're here, it's because home is not safe. So with that in mind, when they come to your meetings, they're bringing all of that, all of those barriers, all of that trauma, but also they're bringing you all of their amazing coping skills and all of the things that they have learned on their own and that work for their communities. So it's very essential to have them at the table, but also to provide them support for self-care. And that is something that that is promoted within some organizations, but not all. So it's a great concept to implement in your meetings. I love that we had this morning a self-care piece, because it's also important for all of us who work with people to practice self-care. Great question. Any other questions?
I just wanted to add that joy is a part of my self-care. Like, we have a lot of things that we're fighting for, but like, you can't take my joy from me. And like, I'm a throw your head back sort of laugher, and that like helps keep me going for sure. We need that joy. Joy is resistance.
All right. Any last comments that you would like to make, panelists?
Yeah, I'll make one last comment. If you're an ally, it was mentioned earlier, make your voice heard in support. That's incredibly important. Like when I'm in a room and I've got allies in the room and they're supportive, that means the world, not just to me, but to other people in the room, because you're saying this person here, what Caleb's saying, what Courtney's saying, what Mira, what Emil is saying is important, and I support it. And so, I try and do that when I'm in a room. If I'm in a room with someone else from a different community, I'm going to hype them up, because people might know me, but they might not know the other people. And so if I put my support behind them, I'm vouching for them. And I appreciate when people vouch for me, because it means a lot. And then one more thing, this is off topic, but please, people, go buy tickets to In the Heights. Support this movie, support this musical, go out and see it. We need more representation in Hollywood. We need more representation for Latinos. So after you're done, go buy your tickets to see In the Heights. You will not regret it.
All right. Well, thank you, everyone. Thank you for giving us your time, your expertise, and everyone that attended the conference will have everyone's contact information. So thank you for everyone who participated also.
Yes, and thank you so much, Sonia. Caleb, you hit on the head. I wanted to also say, Courtney, your point about speaking your support in the moment is so true. And so I just wanted to do that right now, because this IDHRC space is unfamiliar for many of you, so I wanted to thank you for accepting that invitation to come to this space with people that you maybe don't know or not familiar with, and each of you have spoken some really important and challenging truths to us. So I'd like to extend the invitation to each of you to continue to engage with the IDHRC, participate as your schedules allow, because I know each of you is so busy. So big thank you, especially Sonia, for organizing, everybody for extending the invitation on our behalf. So thanks also for everyone who joined us today. Really happy to see everybody here. Our next session is at 1 o'clock. It'll be that in-kind donations 101. So everyone have a great lunch break. And again, thank you. Mira, Courtney, Emil, Caleb, Sonia, we really appreciate your time. Thank you so much.
Thank you.